Troy has fallen. The war that lasted 10 brutal years is finally over. The wooden horse worked, the walls came down, and somewhere on the coast of Asia Minor, a Greek soldier named Odysseus is packing up his ships, ready to sail home to his wife, his son, his island kingdom of Ithaca. It should be simple. Ithaca isn't even that far from Troy. A few weeks by sea, maybe a couple months if the winds are unkind. That's it. That's what should happen. Instead, it takes him 10 more years. 10 years of storms that seem almost personal. 10 years of monsters, enchantresses, lost crews, and a god who seems determined to make sure he never sees home again. By the time Odysseus finally sets foot on Ithaca, 20 years will have passed since he first left for war. His son will have grown from an infant into a young man who doesn't recognize his own father. His wife will have spent 2 decades fending off men who assume her husband is dead. And Odysseus himself will have changed into someone almost unrecognizable, not just from the years, but from everything he's survived. So what happened out there? Why does a short trip home turn into one of the longest, strangest journeys in all of ancient storytelling? That's the mystery we're going to sit with tonight. Not rushing through it, just letting the story unfold the way it was meant to, slowly, night after night, the way people have been telling it for nearly 3,000 years. If you're settling into sleep, this is exactly what I make these for. So go ahead and follow along, and if you don't mind, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing it. Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all reading the same words at completely different moments. It's a small thing, but it always gets me. And if you want the smoothest version of this experience, no ads breaking in right when your eyes are finally getting heavy, no music competing with the words, follow this podcast on Spotify. It's free, it's quiet, and it's linked right there in the description. That one small follow helps more than you'd think. Now, back to Odysseus, because this isn't just a story about a man trying to get home. It's a story about what home even means after everything you've seen and done. It's about cleverness, the kind of quick thinking that gets you out of impossible situations, but also the kind of pride that gets you into them in the first place. It's about temptation, islands where forgetting seems easier than remembering, offers of comfort that ask you to give up everything you were before. And underneath all of it is this quiet, uncomfortable question. How much of what happens to us is fate, and how much do we bring on ourselves? Homer never gives you a simple answer. He gives you a raft, a storm, a cave with something enormous living inside it, and lets you sit with the discomfort of not knowing what's coming next. So let's start at the beginning, or rather, let's start where the story itself begins, years after the war, with a goddess pleading a hero's case to the king of the gods. While somewhere far below, on a lonely stretch of coastline, a man sits staring at the sea, wondering if he'll ever see home again. Before we go any further into the wine-dark sea and the monsters waiting in it, it helps to understand who was actually telling this story, and here's where things get a little murky right from the start. We call the poem's author Homer, but nobody, not ancient scholars, not modern classicists, not anyone in the 28th century since this story first took shape, actually knows who Homer was, or if Homer was even one person at all. The ancient Greeks themselves debated this. Some traditions describe a blind poet from the island of Chios, wandering from city to city, reciting verses for his supper. Other traditions place him in Smyrna, on the coast of what's now Turkey. Some ancient writers thought Homer was a woman. Some modern scholars think Homer wasn't a person at all, but a kind of shorthand, a name attached to centuries of collective storytelling the way we might say traditional, without meaning any specific person invented the tradition. The truth is probably somewhere in the tangle of all of that. Most historians now believe the Odyssey, much like its sibling epic the Iliad, wasn't written the way we write books today. It was composed and performed, shaped over generations by bards who memorized, adapted, and passed down these stories long before anyone thought to write them on a page. This matters more than it might seem, because it explains almost everything strange about how the poem is put together. If you've ever heard the phrase, the wine-dark sea or rosy-fingered dawn, and wondered why Homer keeps repeating the same descriptions over and over, that's not lazy writing. That's the fingerprint of oral tradition. Bards performing these stories from memory, sometimes across hours, sometimes across multiple nights, needed tools to help them remember thousands of lines of verse, and to give themselves breathing room to think ahead while still keeping the rhythm going. Stock phrases, repeated epithets, formulaic scenes of feasting or fighting or sailing, these weren't filler. They were memory scaffolding. They let a performer buy a few seconds to plan the next twist while the audience settled comfortably into familiar rhythms, almost like a musical chorus giving both singer and listener a moment to breathe. It's part of why the story feels so hypnotic to read or to hear. It was built, quite literally, to be heard, not read silently in a chair, the way we experience it now. Now, once you understand that this was oral poetry passed down for generations, probably going back in some form to the Bronze Age itself, the world of the story starts to make more sense too. The Greeks in this poem live by a code that might feel unfamiliar to us, but was absolutely central to how they understood their place in the world. There's kleos, which roughly means glory or fame, the kind of reputation that outlives you, sung about by poets for centuries after you're gone. Achilles chose a short life and eternal kleos over a long forgotten one. Odysseus, interestingly, seems to want both. He wants the glory, but he also, quite desperately, wants to go home and grow old with his wife. That tension between fame and home, between the warrior's glory and the ordinary comfort of your own bed, sits at the very heart of this entire journey. Then there's Xenia, hospitality, which sounds like a small thing, until you realize how much of this story depends on it. In a world without police, without embassies, without any guarantee of safety, when you're a stranger in someone else's land, hospitality was sacred. You fed the traveller at your door before you even asked his name, because that traveller might be a god in disguise, and because someday you might be the one standing hungry at someone else's threshold. Nearly every disaster and every rescue in the Odyssey hinges on whether someone honours or violates this unwritten law, and woven through all of it is piety, respect for the gods, for fate, for the limits of human power. Cross those limits, and the punishment tends to be swift and often creative. As for Ithaca itself, the island Odysseus is fighting so hard to reach, its exact location has puzzled scholars for centuries. The geography Homer describes doesn't perfectly match the modern island that carries the name today, which has led to some fascinating, if inconclusive, theories that ancient Ithaca might have actually been a different island nearby, or that coastlines and place names simply shifted over the almost 1,000 years between when this story is set, roughly the late Bronze Age, and when it was finally written down in the Archaic period. It's a small mystery tucked inside a much bigger one, a reminder that this story sits at the blurry edge between memory and myth, between a real Mycenaean world that once existed and the legendary version of it that poets shaped long after the palaces had already crumbled. And then, of course, there are the gods. Poseidon's rage, Athena's guidance, Zeus weighing fate on his golden scales. It's tempting to read these as simple religious belief, and in some ways they are. But they also function as something more, forces of nature given faces, unpredictable elements of the world explained through personality and grudge, and sometimes even as a way of talking about human choice itself. When Odysseus blinds a Cyclops out of pride rather than necessity, is that Poseidon's wrath, or is it simply the natural consequence of arrogance meeting the wrong audience? Homer seems to want us sitting in that uncertainty. So here's where we stand. 10 years at Troy already behind him. 10 more years now waiting ahead, though of course Odysseus doesn't know that yet. All he knows is that the war is over, and somewhere far away his son is growing up without him, and his wife is running out of excuses for the men circling her door. When the Odyssey actually begins, Odysseus is nowhere in sight. He's off the map, presumed dead by half the world and missing by the other half. Homer starts not with the hero but with the hole he's left behind. On Ithaca, that hole looks like a feast that never ends. Odysseus was king, but not in the sense of an all-powerful monarch with iron laws and a standing army. Think more like a first among nobles. His authority rested on reputation, on personal loyalty, on the understanding that he was the man who could keep the island's fractious clans pointed in roughly the same direction. Take him out of the picture for 20 years, and something predictable starts to happen. Ambitious men drift in. The suitors don't arrive all at once. There's no invasion fleet, no banner raised. It's a slow seep. A young noble from one island, then another, then a cousin, then a friend of a friend, all with plausible excuses. Odysseus has been gone too long. His palace is still rich. His wife is still beautiful. His throne is still technically vacant. They come under the polite pretense of courting Penelope, but they stay because no one makes them leave. Little by little, the centre of power on Ithaca shifts from the absent king's house, ruled in name by his son, to a mob of guests who have quietly become occupiers. They eat Odysseus's flocks, drink his wine, sleep on his couches, order his servants around. And they do it all while insisting that this is just how things are now. A kind of coup carried out with meat, music, and entitlement instead of swords. Caught at the heart of this slow-motion disaster is Penelope. Ancient audiences knew her name as a byword for fidelity, and the poem goes out of its way to underline that. She isn't a warrior, she doesn't sail anywhere, she doesn't call down storms. Her battlefield is a loom. When the suitors press her to choose a new husband, she agrees, but with a condition: she'll marry one of them when she finishes weaving a shroud for Odysseus' elderly father. An act of duty first, then remarriage. By day she weaves under their watchful eyes. By night, when the hall is finally quiet and the torches are dim, she secretly unpicks the work, thread by thread. What looks like delay born of grief is actually a strategy. For 3 years she holds them in this loop, neither accepting nor refusing, waiting for what? News, a sign, or simply more time for a miracle that might never come. But even this cleverness has limits. A disloyal servant girl betrays the secret. The loom becomes a trap instead of a shield. Penelope's reputation is still intact. She hasn't yielded, she hasn't chosen, but the room for manoeuvre is shrinking. She can't throw the suitors out. She has no private army, and her authority is bounded by what men around her will enforce. She can't simply leave. Her identity is tied to the house, to the land, to the role of queen and mother. All she can do is stretch the rules, play for time, and keep her household from collapsing completely. Meanwhile, Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is growing up in the worst possible classroom. He has a royal title, but no practice ruling. He is the rightful heir, but half the older nobles treat him like a minor inconvenience, someone to talk over while they order another round of food. His childhood has happened in a house where his father is a story, not a presence, and where that story is constantly being undercut by the men casually devouring his inheritance. Telemachus is old enough now to feel the insult, but not yet confident enough to answer it. When he tries to speak up in assembly, his voice doesn't quite carry the weight he needs. He doubts himself, doubts whether his father is even alive, doubts whether he has the right to make demands of men who have been warriors longer than he's been breathing. The Odyssey is, among many other things, a coming-of-age story, and it begins with a young man who has to learn how to become his father's son in a world that has largely moved on without him. To a Greek audience, the suitors' behaviour isn't just rude, it's apocalyptic. Remember Xenia, that sacred law of hospitality. They're violating it in almost every possible way. You're supposed to arrive, be fed, be given a gift, and then move on, grateful and respectful. These men arrive, stay indefinitely, insult their host's son, pressure his mother, and consume everything in sight. They turn a place of welcome into a place of predation. That isn't just bad manners, it's a sign that the moral order of the world is cracking. Homer leans into this. The gods themselves comment on it. In the very first book of the poem, Athena persuades Zeus that it's finally time to bring Odysseus home, and one of the reasons she gives is the situation in Ithaca. The suitors aren't just a domestic problem, they're a cosmic one. Their greed and arrogance are the kind of offence the universe itself seems built to correct. Structurally, this is also where the poem does something surprisingly modern. Instead of starting at Troy and moving forward in a straight line, the Odyssey drops us in near the end of the story. Odysseus' wanderings, the monsters, the storms, all of that will be told later in flashback. First we see the consequences of his absence. First we feel the tension building at home. This choice matters. It means that when we later watch Odysseus struggle against cyclopes and whirlpools and tempting islands, we already know exactly what's waiting if he fails to make it back. Not just a disappointed family, but a stolen kingdom, a wife cornered, a son edged out of his future. The suspense isn't will he have adventures, it's will he make it in time to stop this slow-motion collapse? Because what's really at stake in Ithaca isn't only one man's property. It's identity who counts as king, as wife, as heir. It's lineage whose children will inherit the fields and vineyards that have fed these families for generations. It's the basic social order of the island, the unwritten agreements about respect, obligation and restraint that keep violence from erupting. If the suitors can simply eat a man's house empty, pressure his widow, and push aside his son without consequence, then the rules that hold the world together aren't rules anymore. They're suggestions. And into that fraying world, somewhere out on the sea, the man everyone has half forgotten is finally about to start the last leg of his journey home. The first real move against that collapse doesn't come from Odysseus at all. It comes from a young man who has never seen him. Athena decides to intervene, but she doesn't do it by hurling a thunderbolt at the suitors or magically teleporting Odysseus back to his throne. She does something quieter, and in the long run more interesting. She goes to Ithaca in disguise, sits down with Telemachus, and talks to him. In Homer, the gods rarely override human beings like puppeteers. They nudge, they suggest, they awaken desires that were already there but half buried. When Athena tells Telemachus to call an assembly, to speak up, to go searching for news of his father, she's not installing a new personality. She's amplifying the thin, wavering voice in him that already wants to stand up and do something. You can almost hear the inner dialogue. Part of him has spent years thinking, "This is hopeless. My father's probably dead. These men are too powerful." Another part, the part that remembers stories about Odysseus' cleverness and courage, thinks, "I can't just watch this forever." Athena, in a sense, takes that second voice and turns up the volume. Greek audiences would not have heard this as a conflict between fate and free will so much as a partnership. The gods provide courage, clarity and timing, but the mortal still has to act. Athena can suggest the journey, but Telemachus still has to get in the boat. And that journey is not just a private quest to ease his own anxiety. It is a political manoeuvre. When Telemachus stands up in public and announces that he's going to sail to Pylos and Sparta to ask after his father, he's doing several things at once. He's reminding everyone that Odysseus is not officially dead. No funeral has been held, no rites completed, no formal declaration made. As long as that is true, the throne and the estate are not up for legitimate redistribution. He's also staking his claim as a leader. Leaving the island without the suitors' permission is a way of saying, I am not your dependent. He asks for a ship, gathers a small crew, and crucially keeps the plan quiet from the men eating his house bare. In a world where politics is conducted face to face, often over shared meals, simply slipping away is a bold move. The poem underlines this by showing how shocked the suitors are when they realise he's gone. They had gotten used to thinking of him as a boy they could mock in his own hall. Suddenly he looks like something else, a potential rival capable of making alliances abroad, of returning with support. The first stop on this journey is Pylos, home of old King Nestor. By the time Telemachus arrives, Nestor is a living relic of the Trojan War generation. He's the kind of figure who sits at the edge of the fire and tells stories that stretch back further than anyone else's memory. For Telemachus, raised on half-remembered tales and palace gossip, meeting someone who actually fought beside his father is like stepping into a legend. But Nestor doesn't have a neat answer. He doesn't know exactly where Odysseus is. What he has are stories. Stories of Troy, of councils, of quarrels among the leaders, of the chaos when the war finally ended, and each king had to decide how and when to sail home. In these conversations, Telemachus gets his first real education in leadership. Nestor talks about the importance of wise counsel, of listening but not being swayed by every loud voice in the room. He recalls how some commanders rushed home, others lingered to make extra sacrifices. Still others took different routes entirely. Some were rewarded, some ran into storms, some walked straight into ambushes or family disasters waiting back in their palaces. The lesson, half explicit and half between the lines, is that war doesn't end when the last spear is thrown. The hardest part can be what comes after, rebuilding order, managing resentments, keeping people fed and loyal when the battle banners have been rolled up. For Telemachus, who has watched his own house slide toward anarchy without any open battle at all, this is a revelation. Odysseus' delayed return isn't just a sad family story. It's part of a wider pattern of dangerous, uncertain homecomings. Nestor, like any good elder in an oral culture, also understands the power of reputation. News in this world doesn't travel by newspaper or proclamation. It moves in the mouths of travellers, carried on ships, and in the memories of bards. What people believe about you depends on what they've heard sung or said. A king's name is almost a second body that can move where he doesn't, opening doors, securing hospitality, or, if it's bad, closing them. As Telemachus listens, he learns how widely his father's name has spread. Odysseus is remembered as clever, reliable in a crisis, sometimes dangerously so. That reputation is doing work for him even in absence. It gets Telemachus a warm welcome. It earns him trust. It also raises expectations. If a man like that has not come home yet, people assume there must be a story. This too shapes Telemachus's understanding. He starts to see that his father's life is not just a private narrative, but part of a shared mythic fabric. Finding out what happened to Odysseus isn't only a son's duty, it's a question that bothers other kings too. They have an interest in knowing the fates of their fellow leaders, because those fates hint at the state of the world itself, whether the gods are pleased, whether journeys are safe, whether old alliances still hold. The more Telemachus hears about other returns, Agamemnon murdered at his own hearth, Menelaus wandering for years before finally getting back to Sparta, the sharper the contrast with his own situation becomes. Some kings have come home to find their authority shattered by violence. He is living through a different version of the same problem. erosion instead of assassination, insult instead of open attack. And back on Ithaca that erosion continues. While Telemachus gathers stories and slowly pieces together an image of the father he never knew, the suitors plot to intercept him on his way home. The poem lets us feel this double tension, a young man experiencing for the first time what it's like to move confidently among other rulers, while at the same time his absence gives his enemies an opening. Athena's nudge has set him in motion. His own choices are starting to matter. Every friendship he forges, every tale he hears about other men's homecomings, deepens his understanding of what it means to rule and what it will take to reclaim his house. But the central fact remains unchanged. Odysseus is still missing. His name travels, but his body does not. With each mile Telemachus sails, the gap between the idea of the father, hero, strategist, king, and the dangerous reality at home grows wider. The stage is being prepared from both ends, the son slowly learning how to be a ruler, and the pressure cooker on Ithaca inching closer to an explosion that will demand the father's return, if he's alive to make it. From Nestor's rough sea-salted Pylos, Telemachus sails on to a very different world. Sparta in the Odyssey is almost the photographic negative of Ithaca, where his own halls are noisy, wasteful, and on the verge of collapse. Menelaus's palace is wealthy, orderly, and unmistakably under control. The poem lingers on that difference. Everything in Sparta seems to shine. Gold and bronze glitter on the walls. Servants move efficiently. The feasts are lavish, but they are not a chaos of entitlement, the way the suitors' banquets are. There is hierarchy here, and discipline. Menelaus's authority is obvious. People defer to him without bullying or argument. For Telemachus, walking into that space is like stepping into the version of kingship he wishes his own house could be. It shows him what a post-war palace looks like when the king actually comes home, survives the transition, and reasserts control. But under the polish, Sparta is not exactly peaceful. The Trojan War hangs over everything here like a perfume that never quite fades. Menelaus is rich, partly because so many other men never made it back to claim their share of Troy's spoils. He speaks openly about comrades lost at sea, about ships scattered by storms, about long detours through strange lands. His wealth is, in a sense, the sediment of other people's disasters, that prosperity carries a kind of survivor's guilt. And then there is Helen. By the time of Homer, her figure was already controversial. Was she a helpless victim abducted by Paris, a willing adulteress who abandoned her home? Something more complicated, a woman constrained by gods and politics, but not entirely without agency. Different Greek traditions answered that in different ways. The Odyssey never stops to deliver a verdict. Instead, it stages Helen. Telemachus first sees her not as a distant, cursed beauty on a battlement, but as a queen moving through her own house. She is poised, gracious, fully integrated into Spartan life. She notices the resemblance between this shy visitor and Odysseus at once. She chooses when to speak, what story to tell, how to frame the past. At one point she quietly slips a drug into the wine that steals away grief and anger, so that the evening's memories will not collapse into uncontrollable weeping. Ancient audiences would have recognized that as a sign of skill and danger at once. Helen knows how to change people's emotional reality. She can soothe or distort, maybe both at the same time. Her version of history emphasizes her regret, her longing for home, the way she recognized Odysseus when he crept into Troy in disguise and chose not to expose him. Menelaus's version, told later, leans into her enchantment by Aphrodite, her almost hypnotic effect on men. Side by side, their stories do something the poem is very good at. They remind you that what happened after Troy is always filtered through the mouths of survivors. Charm, status, and narrative all shape truth here. Helen and Menelaus are the ultimate high-status storytellers about the war that defined their generation. They do not just remember it, they curate it. Telemachus sits in a hall where everything gleams and listens to a couple whose marriage almost tore the Greek world apart. Now they are the image of reconciliation. How much of that image is sincere peace, and how much is the result of years spent deciding which parts of the past to emphasize, which to soften, which to drug with forgetfulness? The poem leaves that open. Their presence also throws Penelope's situation into a different light. Helen, once the paradigmatic bad wife in Greek moralizing, is here, again and again, shown as respected and powerful in her household. Penelope, the model of loyalty, is back in Ithaca, surrounded by men who treat her as if she were already forfeit. It is not a simple contrast of virtue rewarded and sin punished. It feels more like a reflection on how appearances and outcomes do not line up neatly. A woman can be slandered and still sit securely on a throne. Another can be exemplary and still see her position eroded day by day. Meanwhile, Menelaus's own story of getting home offers Telemachus a preview of what Odysseus is up against. Menelaus did not simply sail straight from Troy to Sparta. He wandered through Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean, blown off course, detained by local rulers, forced to solve strange divine puzzles. In one famous episode he has to grapple with the shape-shifting sea god Proteus, wrestling him through a series of transformations until the god finally yields information. The message embedded in that story is clear. The seas after Troy are not just physically dangerous, they are morally and intellectually testing. The gods demand intelligence, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncertainty head-on. In the middle of this tale comes the detail that matters most for the Odyssey's plot. Proteus, when finally pinned down, lists for Menelaus the fates of the other Greek leaders. Some are dead, some safely home. Odysseus, Proteus says, is alive, but trapped on a distant island, held against his will. For the first time in the poem we get a divine external confirmation that Odysseus has not died anonymously in some forgotten wave. He is suffering, but he exists fixed like a single bright star in a sky of guesswork. That single piece of information changes the stakes of Telemachus's journey. When he left Ithaca, the best he could hope for was a rumour, a probability. Maybe his father had died decently. Maybe he was lost beyond recall. Maybe he had chosen some new life elsewhere. Every scenario was vague. Now there is a concrete outline, alive, far away, prevented from returning. It doesn't yet tell Telemachus how to fix anything. He is not suddenly equipped to sail off to that nameless island and break a goddess hold. But it does sharpen his purpose. His father's absence is no longer just a long silence. It is a wrong that might, in principle, be righted. When he eventually turns back toward Ithaca, he does so with two new things he did not have when he crept out under the suitors' noses. He has seen a functioning palace where war trauma has been absorbed rather than allowed to devour the household. He has watched how powerful people narrate their pasts to justify present arrangements, how charm and authority can smooth over fractures without necessarily healing them. And he carries the knowledge that Odysseus exists somewhere out on the wide sea, blocked but not erased. All of that tightens the thread that connects the wandering father and the endangered home. The return to Ithaca will not just be a young man slipping back into the same precarious position. It will be a return with clearer eyes and with the unspoken understanding that time is running out for the house, for the marriage under siege, and for the man battling far away to come home at all. While Telemachus is sailing homeward with new knowledge, the poem quietly shifts our view across the sea to the man at the centre of that knowledge. Odysseus is not in battle, not in a storm, not in some active test of strength or cunning. He is sitting on a shore, staring at the horizon, crying. Homer's description on Ogygia is almost monotonous on purpose. Day after day, Odysseus walks to the same stretch of coast, looks out toward Ithaca, and weeps. The island itself is lush, fragrant, overflowing with natural beauty. Calypso's cave is shaded by trees, watered by springs, surrounded by birdsong. In later traditions, it will be imagined almost like a prototype of paradise. But the man in the middle of it is exhausted by happiness he did not choose. Calypso, whose name implies to conceal or to hide, has pulled him out of the deadly sea and kept him alive. She offers him food, a bed, a body, a distraction from grief. In many ways, she is doing what Helen's drugged wine did in Sparta, softening sharp emotions, blurring pain, making unbearable memories survivable. And she offers something more extreme than Helen ever could. She offers to stop the clock. If he stays with her, she promises, he need not age. He can have immortality or something very close to it, an endless extension of his prime, in a place without war, without political responsibility, without the constant fear of loss. On paper, it sounds like the ultimate reward for a man who has suffered through 10 years at Troy, and more years on the sea. No more armour, no more oars, no more blood on the sand. But this is where the Odyssey becomes psychologically sharp. Odysseus does not reject Calypso because she is ugly, cruel, or uninteresting. The poem makes a point of saying the opposite. She is beautiful. Their nights together are physically pleasurable. When she later accuses the gods of hypocrisy, of begrudging immortal women their mortal lovers, she speaks with a kind of bitter clarity that is hard not to sympathize with. The problem is that the price of her offer is to unhook himself from his own story. To accept immortality with Calypso would mean letting Ithaca go, not just practically but in terms of meaning. His marriage, his son, his father, his ancestors' land, the reputation he had earned at Troy, even the unfinished business with the suitors he does not yet know about, all of that would, in time, dissolve into something like a distant dream he once had as a mortal. Paradise becomes a kind of padded cell, safe, pleasant, anesthetized. A lot of readers and scholars have seen Ogygia as an image of the temptation to turn away from the hard, messy work of living a finite human life. You can call it a fantasy of retirement, or of eternal vacation, or of a kind of spiritual bypass, skipping the grief and responsibility and jumping straight to endless comfort. But the Odyssey, which is relentlessly interested in home, inheritance, and the weaving together of generations, does not present that as neutral. Healing that becomes permanent avoidance turns quietly into stagnation. And so Odysseus endures. The poem uses that word deliberately. His time on Ogygia is not a blank gap. It is another test, but of a different kind. Instead of monsters and enemies, the enemy is contentment without purpose. His heroic act here is not slaying anything. It is refusing to let pleasant captivity rewrite what he wants. While he is wrestling with that, the gods are wrestling with him. Up on Olympus, the problem of Odysseus comes up again. Athena, who has already been agitating on his behalf, presses the issue. How long will this man, who has honoured the gods and suffered enough, be left to rot on a distant island? The divine debate is important because it frames the whole story as something more than just bad luck. Poseidon still hates Odysseus for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. As long as the sea god is enraged, the route home is not just choppy, it is politically blocked. Zeus listens. His own position is complicated. He is the supposed guarantor of Xenia, the guest friendship that should protect strangers. Keeping a guest against his will violates that. At the same time, Zeus has to manage divine egos, especially Poseidon's. The council scene implies a careful balance, acknowledging the sea god's grievance, but also asserting that a mortal who has suffered as much as Odysseus deserves at least the possibility of a return. Eventually Zeus decides to intervene, but in a way that preserves the sense of struggle. Odysseus will not be teleported home. He will be given a chance to leave. That decision comes down to earth in the form of Hermes. Hermes, the messenger god and patron of travellers, is sent to Ogygia with a blunt directive. Calypso must let Odysseus go. Her reaction is remarkably human. She greets Hermes, offers hospitality, and then, when she hears the order, breaks into a complaint that sounds like an ancient critique of divine double standards. Male gods can take mortal lovers and discard them without consequence. Female immortals who love mortal men, she says, are mocked and punished. Now she is being forced to release the one she has saved and cherished. The poem gives her room to voice that grievance. It does not erase her pain. But it also does not overturn Zeus's command. After the protest, she complies. Her compliance, though, is not simply snapping her fingers and making a ship appear. That would be too easy for the story the Odyssey wants to tell. Instead, she walks down to the beach, and for the first time speaks openly to Odysseus about his freedom. She tells him he may build a raft. She will provide tools, timbers, cloth for a sail, provisions for the journey. She even swears by the most solemn oaths the gods possess that she is not secretly plotting his death. Then the weight shifts back to him. Odysseus has to decide again whether to trust this, whether to risk the open sea instead of the known safety of the island. His response is cautious. He questions her, makes sure the promise is binding. The war-hardened strategist inside him has not been dulled by years of enforced leisure. Once convinced, he throws himself into the work. The poem slows down over the building of the raft more than it strictly needs to for plot. It lists the trees he cuts, the tools he uses, the way he shapes and joins the timbers, the care he puts into the sail and steering gear. This is not a magic chariot. It is craft. All the qualities that defined him before: technical skill, patience, the ability to plan and execute a complex task, flare back to life. The island that has been a gilded cage becomes, for a few days, a shipyard. At the same time, the cost of leaving is real. He is not indifferent to Calypso. When she confronts him one last time, asking whether Penelope can possibly match her in beauty or in youth, he answers with careful honesty. No, he says, Penelope is not her equal in outward form. She is mortal, age will touch her, Calypso will never fade. But she is his wife. Ithaca is his home. That is the axis his life has been built around. To stay would be to step out of that axis into something that might be delightful, but would no longer be his. So he chooses the raft, the sea, and the possibility of suffering over the certainty of a painless eternity. Hermes has delivered the message. Calypso has obeyed with as much grace as her situation allows. The gods have opened a small door in the wall of divine grudges and storm gods. Through that door, on crude timbers lashed together by his own hands, Odysseus pushes himself back into the dangerous finite world where men can drown, grow old, and go home. For a brief moment it looks like the story might actually go smoothly. Odysseus launches his raft, sets his makeshift sail, and the poem lets him enjoy, for a handful of days, something like cooperation from the elements. A favourable wind, clear skies, the kind of quiet progress sailors pray for and rarely get. Athena helps. She straightens his course, calms the waves, guides him toward the land of the Phaeacians, Scheria, a place that will matter a lot in a few lines. The sense, if you're drifting off to sleep with this story in your ears, is that everything might finally be aligning. The gods have spoken. The hero has chosen hardship over comfort. The worst is behind him. And then Poseidon comes back on stage. He has been away in distant lands, the poem says, delighting himself among the Ethiopians. When he returns and sees Odysseus out on open water, alive, almost free of Calypso's island, something in him snaps. This is the man who blinded his son Polyphemus. This is the mortal whose name the Cyclops screamed as he called down a curse. That curse is important. Polyphemus had not simply shouted in anger, he had asked his father for specific retribution. If Odysseus is fated to reach home, let it be late, alone, after losing all companions in a stranger's ship to find trouble waiting there. Poseidon's rage is partly personal, the fury of a father defending his offspring's honour, but it is also a reaction to being bypassed. The other gods have conspired, gently, diplomatically, but still to move Odysseus along, without clearing it fully with the sea god who controls the medium he has to cross. Divine pride is at stake. In a world where the ocean is life and trade and war and boundary, the god of that ocean is not a minor bureaucrat. He is a power you cannot casually ignore. So Poseidon decides to remind everyone, especially Odysseus, that the sea does not have to say yes. The storm he unleashes is not just weather, it is intention. Winds from every direction slam into the raft. Waves pile up like moving hills. The carefully built craft that seemed so solid on Calypso's beach starts tearing apart under forces it was never meant to meet. If Calypso's island was a test of whether Odysseus could endure comfort, this is the opposite, a test of whether he can endure absolute helplessness. The poem leans into the physicality of it. Timbers wrench free. The mast snaps, the sail shreds, Odysseus is thrown, dragged under, battered by broken planks and choking foam. This is not a symbolic drowning. It is the kind of detailed bodily struggle that sailors listening to the story would have felt in their own lungs and muscles. All his titles, King of Ithaca, Destroyer of Cities, the Man of Many Wiles, mean nothing in that water. What matters is whether he can surface, whether he can cling to something that still floats, whether he can keep his mind clear enough to make even tiny choices, when to let a wave carry him, when to dive through it, when to rest for 2 breaths instead of 1. At the very edge of this chaos, another figure appears, Ino, sometimes called Leucothea, a sea goddess, who once was mortal in some older myths, now transformed into a kind of watery protector. She rises from the breakers and offers him a veil, a sash, a band of cloth, and tells him to strip off his heavy clothes, abandon what's left of the raft, and trust her charm. Wrap the veil around his chest, leap in, and swim for land. When he is safe, he must throw it back into the sea without looking. On one level, this is pure mythic aid. A supernatural being interrupts certain death with a magical object. The hero is given a temporary insurance policy, a literal lifeline, from beyond. Ancient audiences would have recognized this pattern from countless stories, the god who hands you the tool you need at the last possible moment. But the veil has also drawn a lot of interpretive attention. Some readers see it as a symbol of that thin, irrational decision to keep going, when nothing in your situation justifies confidence. A scrap of cloth is not much against the entire Aegean. Yet Odysseus takes it, follows the instructions, and survives. Others note that Ino herself once crossed a boundary, from human to divine, and that her aid marks exactly that moment when a drowning man leaves the human world's normal limits and steps into a kind of in-between state, neither saved nor lost, not yet on any shore. Whatever level you read it on, the scene drives home something about the Odyssey's understanding of survival. It is not just about strength or cleverness, it is about accepting help you do not entirely understand, improvising with whatever is left, and trusting that a direction, any direction toward land, is better than clinging to wreckage in the middle of nowhere. The swim to Scheria is brutal. Odysseus is driven off course, flung toward rocks, forced again and again to choose between immediate safety and long-term survival. Clinging to a jagged cliff face might keep him from drowning, but the pounding surf threatens to smash him against stone. Letting go feels like surrendering to death. Yet he keeps testing the water, looking for a place where the waves break just gently enough for him to slip through. By the time he finds the river mouth that will finally let him in, he is scraped, swollen, and barely conscious. He stumbles ashore, buries the veil as instructed, or rather throws it back and turns away, and crawls into a pile of leaves to sleep like an animal. No entourage, no armour, no visible signs of rank. This is how he reaches Scheria, not as a celebrated war hero, not as a charismatic guest introduced with ceremony, but as a shipwrecked stranger, naked and unrecognisable. The relief here is real. He is on solid ground. The immediate threat of drowning is over. But the poem does not let it feel entirely safe. He does not know where he is, who lives there, what customs they follow, whether he has finally escaped Poseidon's attention or just washed up into another kind of danger. Storms in the Odyssey have this resetting function. Every time the sea rises against Odysseus, it strips away something: ships, comrades, possessions, illusions of control, and leaves him closer to the core of himself. The storm off Ogygia is a particularly sharp version of that. It takes the carefully prepared raft, the divine permissions, the sense that he has earned smooth passage by making the right moral choice, and it dismantles all of it in a few hours. The message is not that virtue is meaningless, but that the world he lives in does not convert virtue directly into safety. What he has left crawling under those Styrian trees is something smaller and harder to dramatize, the stubborn capacity to keep moving toward home even after the sea, in the voice of a god's anger, has said no. Morning in Scheria begins not with a trumpet blast or divine proclamation, but with laundry. Athena drifts into the dreams of a young princess named Nausicaa and nudges her with a worry that would make sense to any aristocratic girl in that world. Her clothes, and the clothes of her future husband, need washing. It sounds trivial, but in Homeric society, textiles are wealth, status, and reputation. Clean, well-made clothes are a social calling card. So Nausicaa wakes with marriage on her mind, not war. She persuades her father to lend her a wagon and mules and goes down to the river with her maids, chattering, playing, doing ordinary work in an ordered kingdom. It's domestic, almost pastoral, the opposite of the storm we just left. And it is into this scene that Odysseus emerges, literally from the bushes, naked, caked in salt and leaves. A wreck in human form. The poem lingers on the danger of this moment. A strange man alone, disfigured by hardship, approaching a group of young women in a culture that takes female honour and male restraint very seriously. One wrong movement, one misjudged word, and this episode could turn ugly or fatal. Athena helps again this time, not with winds but with courage. She steadies Nausicaa so she does not bolt like her attendants. And then the narrative slows down around Odysseus' choices. He debates with himself. Does he fling himself at her knees, the traditional gesture of supplication, or keep a distance so he doesn't terrify her? He decides to stand back and rely on speech instead. He covers himself as best he can with a branch. He praises her beauty, but tactfully, carefully, comparing her to a goddess without sounding like he is trying to seduce her. He calls on Zeus as the protector of strangers and beggars. Everything in his address is calibrated. He admits his desperation without sounding unhinged. He asks not for luxury, but for basic things. Some rags to wrap himself, a hint of where he is. He never gives his name. This is one of the Odyssey's clearest studies in controlled vulnerability. Odysseus has to reveal enough of his need to trigger compassion, but not so much that he seems dangerous or pitiably broken. Nausicaa has to open herself to a stranger without compromising the norms that protect her and her household. She passes the test. She offers clothing, food, directions to the city. She instructs her maids not to fear him. At the same time, she is careful about how this will look. Odysseus must follow behind the wagon when they go back. She will not walk publicly into town with a strange, handsome man at her side and feed gossip. Trust, but tactful trust. When Odysseus reaches the palace, the poem shifts from riverbank improvisation to the full ritual of xenia, hospitality. Charybdis becomes a kind of textbook in how this system is supposed to work. He is told by Nausicaa, and then by Athena in disguise, exactly what to do. Go straight to Queen Arete, clasp her knees, and ask for safe passage home. This is unusual in many Homeric scenes. The king is the obvious focal point. Here, the queen is the one whose judgment matters most. So he does as instructed. He moves through the shining halls of the Phaeacians, marvels at their technology, ships that almost steer themselves prosperity everywhere, but does not get distracted. He falls at Arete's knees and says, "Essentially, I am a sufferer at your mercy. I need clothes, a way home, and the grace of your people." Alcinous, the king, reacts with immediate generosity. He rebukes anyone who would leave a stranger in the ashes by the hearth, calls for a feast, calls for a bed. Only after Odysseus is bathed, fed, and rested do the questions begin. This is xenia at its best. First you stabilize the guest, then you inquire. Arete, however, notices something sharper. The clothes he is wearing are ones she has woven, given to Nausicaa. She asks the uncomfortable question, "Who are you really, and how did you come by these garments?" Again, Odysseus chooses what to reveal. He tells the story of Calypso and the storm. He praises Nausicaa, but avoids saying anything that would compromise her reputation. He still withholds his name. He offers narrative instead of identity. The Phaeacians respond by moving him from stranger to quasi-family. They plan sacrifices to ensure his safe journey. They arrange games to honour him, foot races, wrestling, discus, boxing. When he is hesitant to participate, one young man mocks him as unathletic, maybe even cowardly. That hits a nerve. Odysseus, still unnamed, seizes a discus and hurls it farther than anyone else, strength restored and displayed. Then comes the part of Phaeacian culture that matters most for the larger poem, the songs. They call for Demodocus, the blind bard, and ask for stories. He sings about quarrels among the gods, about the love affair of Ares and Aphrodite, about the Trojan War itself. At one point he describes in detail the wooden horse and the sack of Troy. Odysseus breaks down in tears. He is listening to his own life turned into art, his own actions becoming collective memory. The room notices. Alcinous notices. This is where storytelling reveals character in a way no interrogation could. The king gently stops the entertainment and addresses his guest directly. "Who are you, that you react like this? Not just your name, but your lineage, your city, the path that led you to my hall." In that question, "Tell us who you are," the Odyssey turns inward. The safe harbour of Scheria, the perfected hospitality of the Phaeacians, becomes the frame for the longest flashback in Greek literature. Odysseus, at last, will narrate his own wandering. The poem has ferried him to a place stable enough, kind enough, for him to look backward and make sense of everything that happened after Troy. Odysseus doesn't begin with glory. When Alcinous asks for his name and his story, Odysseus finally speaks it aloud. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known among men for my cunning." It's a small return of identity after so much anonymity. But instead of launching into the triumphant fall of Troy, he pivots immediately to what came next. Leaving Troy, the poem suggests, is not like leaving a finished job site. It's more like stepping out of a burning building, smoke still in your lungs, not sure if the foundations will hold or collapse behind you. The Greeks have won, but the city is ash and corpses. The gods are angry and nobody is quite sure what that victory will cost. Odysseus' fleet pushes off into this uncertainty. Sails fill, oars dip, and the coastline of ruined Troy shrinks behind them. They should go home. Instead, they turn aside to a place called Ismarus, city of the Cicones. What happens there is one of the Odyssey's most compact moral lessons. Odysseus leads a textbook raid. They hit the city fast, catch the Cicones off guard, cut down the defending men. They take plunder, they take women, they take wine. By the logic of their world, this is not unusual. War is still echoing in their blood. But then Odysseus makes a choice that shows why he often survives where others don't. He says, in essence, we have enough. Let's leave now. His men refuse. They are drunk on success and literally drunk on the captured wine. They feast on the beach. They drive off the cattle. They linger as plunderers always linger, thinking the danger is behind them. It isn't. The Cicones have allies inland, warriors who fight on horseback and in chariots, and they are not disorganized victims. At dawn they counterattack. The scene flips. The raiders become the panicked defenders. The ships that had looked like symbols of freedom suddenly become fragile lifeboats. Odysseus' men fall in heaps. For every ship, 6 companions die. The fleet escapes, but only barely, dragging grief out to sea with them. Here the poem does something important. It doesn't blame this disaster on Poseidon, or fate, or a curse. It is the direct result of a very human failure, greed, indiscipline, the inability of a leader to make his men listen when the party is good and the danger feels far away. Odysseus can see the right action. He cannot always enforce it. The Odyssey keeps coming back to this limit. He is clever, cautious, often pious. His crews are not necessarily any of those things. Leadership in this world is less about issuing commands and more about wrestling with other people's desires, and losing again and again in ways that cost lives. After the grief at Ismarus, Zeus himself seems to underline the warning. A storm drives them off course, pushes the fleet away from its plotted track, turns the clear route home into a fog of uncertainty. For 9 days they are blown about. On the 10th they land among the Lotus-Eaters. There is no battle here, no walls, no spears. The people of this place are not hostile. They offer food, but the food is the danger. The Lotus in Homer isn't about wild pleasure, frenzied ecstasy or some psychedelic vision. Its effect is quieter and in a way more terrifying. Those who taste it simply lose the desire to go home. They sit down, they forget, their past, their plans, their obligations drift away like smoke. This is temptation not as excess, but as erasure. No whips, no chains, just the soft dissolving of purpose. Odysseus sends out a small scouting party. They meet the Lotus-Eaters, accept the plant, and do not come back. Time passes. No alarm sounds, nothing attacks. The danger is that nothing hurts. Realizing what has happened, Odysseus acts with a kind of violence that in any other context would seem cruel. He does not argue with the enchanted men. He does not sit down beside them and try to persuade them with memories of Ithaca. He drags them, weeping, back to the ships. He ties them under the benches so they cannot crawl back onto shore. He orders the rest to get to the oars immediately. No one is to taste the lotus, no one is to be left behind. It is harsh mercy. He is forcing them to suffer again, to remember hunger, salt, hardship, instead of letting them glide into painless forgetfulness. In the logic of the poem, this is real care. To love someone is not just to comfort them, it is to refuse on their behalf, the kind of comfort that would strip them of themselves. With the Cicones, the men chose indulgence and paid with blood. With the Lotus-Eaters, they nearly choose oblivion and would have paid with identity. In both episodes, Odysseus stands at the edge, watching small choices flower into enormous consequences. A pattern is beginning to emerge, one that will repeat in darker and darker forms. The obstacles on this journey are not just monsters and storms. They are decisions whether to stay a little longer, to eat a forbidden thing, to forget a hard promise. Every time, the cost grows, and somewhere beyond the horizon, gods who hold grudges are watching, waiting for the next mistake. After the drifting dream of the lotus shore, the next land feels solid, almost promising. They see smoke, they see flocks, they see a fertile island just offshore, full of fat goats that have never heard a hunting cry. Odysseus and his men land their first feast, and sleep in safety. The main coast, visible across a narrow strait, can wait until morning. This little pause matters. It shows us there was an easier route. They could have been content with the goat island, taken what they needed and gone. Instead, curiosity wakes with the dawn. Odysseus wants to see who lives on the mainland. Not just to trade, he says, but to test whether the locals are civilized or savage, whether they understand the sacred rules of hospitality, xenia, that bind guest and host. This is not pure scientific curiosity. There is entitlement mixed in. He chooses a single ship, leaves the rest of the fleet behind, and says, in effect, let's go see what gifts these people will give us. In the world of the poem, a wandering hero expects some offerings: food, shelter, perhaps a token of respect. The line between exploration and exploitation is already blurry. They find a cave, inside, racks of cheese, pens of lambs and kids, orderly tools, vessels of milk and whey. It looks, in every way, like someone's home. His men are instantly practical. Take the cheese, take the animals, get out before the owner comes back. Odysseus refuses. He wants to see the host, to test his heart. Part of this is the code of xenia. Part of it is a familiar human impulse, to believe the story will turn out better if he waits for the main character to appear. They build a fire. They eat some of the owner's food. They settle in and wait. It is an intrusion wrapped in the expectation of welcome. Then the owner returns, and the whole idea of welcome is torn apart. Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is not a noble giant misunderstood by history. Homer makes him very clear. He is powerful, self-sufficient, and outside all the normal bonds of human society. He drives his flocks into the cave, rolls an enormous stone across the entrance, a door that only he can move, and finally turns his single eye toward the strangers. Odysseus opens with the standard formula. He invokes Zeus, god of guests and hosts. He asks for gifts. He assumes that, whatever else this being is, he must respect that basic law. Polyphemus laughs. He says he does not care about Zeus. He does not care about the gods at all. Then, calmly, he reaches down, grabs two of Odysseus's men, smashes them on the ground like animals, and eats them raw. The scene is deliberately shocking, not just the violence, but the total absence of reciprocity. No introduction, no exchange of names, no ritual. The world that gave meaning to xenia, the shared understanding between stranger and host, simply does not exist here. Night falls, the stone is in place, the survivors are trapped. Here, Odysseus's famous cleverness becomes a technology of survival. He cannot kill the Cyclops. Even if he could drive a spear through that single eye, he and his men could never move the rock at the cave mouth. Killing the monster would mean starving in a dark tomb, so he thinks sideways. He offers wine. Strong wine, unmixed, far more potent than what Polyphemus is used to. The Cyclops, pleased and unsuspecting, drinks deeply. His mood softens. He demands the stranger's name. Odysseus answers, nobody. In Greek, it's a punning word that can also sound like no man. It is both a lie and a spell. He is reshaping how his enemy will talk about him. Drunk and satisfied, Polyphemus promises to eat nobody last, as a courtesy. Then he collapses into sleep. Odysseus acts quickly. With the remaining men, he hardens a huge stake in the fire, lifts it, and drives it into that single eye. The giant wakes, screaming, thrashing, bellowing for help. Other Cyclopes gather outside the cave, shouting questions through the stone. Who is hurting you? And Polyphemus roars back the prepared answer. Nobody is hurting me. Nobody is killing me by force or treachery, so they shrug and go away. If no one is attacking him, then there is nothing to be done. The name has done its work. Odysseus has taken the Cyclops' own voice and turned it into a prison. Morning brings a new problem. The stone is still in place. Polyphemus, now blind, feels every animal as he lets his flocks out, running his hands over their backs to catch any escaping men. Odysseus answers with another layer of ingenuity. He lashes his men beneath the rams, 3 at a time, clinging to the woolly bellies while he himself grips the underside of the largest ram. As the animals file out, the Cyclops touches only their backs. He never imagines that the humans might be under the flock, not on top of it. This is a different kind of courage than battlefield valour. It is terror endured in stillness, intelligence pressed against fear. Every second under those animals is a gamble, that the giant will not change his pattern, will not think of a new way to search. They make it out. They reach the ship. They row hard, the shoreline shrinking. At this point the story could have been clean. Disaster, improvisation, escape. But Odysseus is not just the man of many wiles. He is also a man who wants his name attached to his deeds. From the safety of the widening water he shouts back. He taunts the blinded giant, and then he does the one thing that undoes all his perfect anonymity. He tells Polyphemus his real name. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities. It is a burst of pride, of narrative instinct. He cannot bear that this extraordinary escape be remembered without his authorship. Polyphemus, in agony, stretches his hands to the sky and prays not to no one, but to his father Poseidon. He asks that Odysseus never reach home, or if fate insists that he must, that he come late alone in pain to a house full of trouble. In that moment, a private quarrel becomes a divine vendetta. The curse lands. The sea god listens. The rest of the Odyssey will unfold under that shadow. Ancient audiences hearing this scene were likely pulled in 2 directions. On one hand, Odysseus's cunning is admirable. He saves his men from certain death with nothing but words, timing, and nerve. On the other, his need to announce himself to trade safety for glory feels like a crack in his wisdom, a flaw with enormous consequences. Is he a hero asserting his kleos, his fame, as any proper warrior should? Or is he a man who cannot keep silent when silence would save him? The poem doesn't answer outright. It lets you feel both, the thrill of outwitting a monster and the sinking weight of a curse he could have avoided. In the cave of the Cyclops, heroism and hubris are separated by a single shouted name, and from now on every wave that lifts Odysseus's ship will carry, somewhere beneath it, the anger of a god he made for himself. Odysseus is now a man with a god's anger on his back, and a name that echoes in divine ears. The next stop seems at first like a pause in the punishment. They come to the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. This is not just a random king with a palace and a throne. Homer calls him dear to the immortal gods. He is, in effect, the manager of the weather, the one who can turn chaos into ordered breezes. Odysseus is welcomed. Again we see the pattern of Xenia, but here it's almost exaggerated. A full month of feasting questions, stories. Odysseus tells of Troy, of storms, of Cyclops. Aeolus listens, and for once the reaction from a powerful being is not rage, not rivalry, but sympathy. When it is finally time to go, Aeolus doesn't simply wish him good luck. He gives him something extraordinary, all the hostile winds bound up in a leather bag, every gust and squall that could push a ship off course, tied and sealed with a silver cord. The implication is clear. With this, the journey home is no longer at the mercy of chance. Only the gentle west wind is left free to blow them toward Ithaca. The path is straight. The sea is tamed. Odysseus, for the first time since leaving Troy, holds something like certainty in his hands. He does not share the secret. He alone knows what is in the bag. He alone ties it to the ship. He alone stands watch, gripping the tiller, refusing to sleep for 9 days and nights, as the west wind pushes them closer and closer to the home that has become a ghost in his mind. On the 10th day, Ithaca appears. They can see it, so close that the crew sees firelight on the shore. The names of wives and children are probably already on their tongues. After war, storms, monsters, here finally is the solid line of the finish. And Odysseus, exhausted, closes his eyes. The poem is quiet about the exact thoughts of the crew, but the situation is easy to reconstruct. For 9 days their leader has clutched a mysterious bag, refused to let anyone touch it, refused even to rest. They know Aeolus gave it to him. They know gifts from hosts are often wealth, gold, silver, fine cloth. They also know something about hierarchy. They have watched their commander make choices that cost lives and win glory. They have seen him keep knowledge to himself. They have watched disaster and miracle follow in his wake. So the bag, heavy and secret, becomes a symbol. Maybe it is treasure he plans to hoard. Maybe it is proof that when it comes down to it, he is thinking of his own household first, and their household second. Trust, already frayed by loss and fear, begins to unravel. While Odysseus sleeps, they make a choice. They untie the cord. In an instant, everything that had been bound is freed. The jar of thunder is opened. The captive winds roar out, not in a gentle sigh, but in a violent tumbling chaos that grabs the ship, spins it, hurls it backward into the open sea. The harbour lights of Ithaca vanish. The coastline dissolves into mist. When Odysseus wakes, the world he fell asleep in, a world with home on the horizon, is gone. He is back in the middle of the ocean. The bag empty and useless at his feet, the men mute with shame and terror. They row back to Aeolia, hoping for a reset, a second sealing of the winds, another proof that divine favour can be renewed like a contract. Odysseus pleads his case. It was my crew, not me. Give us one more chance. Aeolus refuses, not with anger, but with a kind of wary piety. He says the gods clearly hate this man. To help him again would be to resist their will. The door of hospitality closes. The house of the wind is no longer a refuge. It is as if a stamp has been placed on Odysseus, too cursed to touch. This episode often gets summarized as the crew's greed ruined everything, but greed is only the surface. Underneath is a more familiar pattern: secrecy from above, suspicion from below, and the way fear fills the space where trust should be. Odysseus could have told them what was in the bag. He could have framed it as a shared miracle, a collective responsibility. Instead, he carries it alone, literally and figuratively, until his body fails and his men act on the story they have invented in the silence. Our leader is hiding wealth from us. Their fear of being cheated becomes the act that cheats them all. Their suspicion of betrayal leads directly to the catastrophe they dread, being cut off again from home, from families, from safety. It is a self-fulfilling tragedy, not imposed by a monster or a random storm, but generated inside the fragile ecosystem of a crew. Up to this point, the journey can be read as a series of external obstacles: storms, giants, strange lands. With the bag of winds, the poem quietly shifts. The most dangerous currents are no longer only in the sea. They are in the minds of the men, in the invisible weather of leadership, morale, and fear. From here on, every island will be both a place on a map and a test of character. The distance to Ithaca is not just measured in miles, but in whether this group of human beings can hold together long enough to cross them. Here, on the invisible line between sighting home and losing it, we see how easily a journey can be wrecked not by enemies, but by the collapse of trust on board. They sail on with that failure sitting between them like a third presence. No more Aeolus, no more second chances from the gods of weather. Just men at oars, a captain at the tiller, and a silence that has not yet turned into open revolt, but has stopped feeling like loyalty. Days pass, the sea is the same indifferent grey it has always been. Then, at last, something that looks like relief. A coastline, a narrow entrance, a calm enclosed harbour. Homer lingers on this harbour. It has steep cliffs curving around in a perfect circle, with a narrow mouth just wide enough for a ship to slip through. Inside, the water is still, windless, safe, the kind of place any sailor would pray for after too many nights on open water. To tired men this would look like a gift. No crashing surf, no exposed beach where raiders or storms can surprise you. A natural stone wall on every side, a single clean doorway to the sea. Odysseus is cautious but not yet paranoid. He sends one ship inland along a freshwater stream to look for people, for food, for the rituals of hospitality that have gotten them this far. The rest of the fleet rows through the narrow mouth and ties up inside the circular bay. Sterns pointed to the land, bows pointed to the calm centre. Only Odysseus holds back. He moors his own ship just outside the harbour, tying it to the cliff, as if some quiet part of his mind has learned to mistrust anything that seems too perfectly safe. The poem doesn't explain this decision in detail, it just notes it. A small, almost accidental precaution. Inside the harbour, his men are ringed by rock, lulled by the quiet water. They cannot see the land above, they cannot see what is moving there. The scouting party follows the stream inland and reaches a city. At first it looks normal enough. Streets, a palace, a girl fetching water. They speak to her, are directed to the king. The pattern of Xenia seems about to repeat. Strangers arrive, they approach the ruler, they ask for food, for news, for the possibility of passage. Then the pattern breaks. The king antiphates, is not merely unfriendly. He is something else entirely, a giant, a cannibal. Instead of greeting the guests, he calls his wife, who is even larger than he is, and together they do the one thing that shatters any illusion that this is civilized space. They seize one of Odysseus' men and eat him on the spot. Hospitality becomes horror in a single gesture. The other two scouts run for their lives. What happens next is quick, brutal, and almost impersonal. There is no dialogue, no extended speeches. just action described with the cold efficiency of a nightmare. The Laestrygonian giants swarm to the cliffs, ringing the harbour, each one lifting a boulder that would take a team of normal men to budge. They hurl them down onto the trapped ships below. Masts snap. Hulls crack. The harbour that looked like a cradle becomes a stone mortar, and the ships inside are the pestle being ground to splinters. The crews have nowhere to run. The narrow entrance that felt like a protective gate is now a choke point. As the rocks smash the vessels, the giants spear the men in the water like fish, Homer says, skewering them and carrying them off to eat. Odysseus, outside the harbour, sees the chaos erupt. He does not call for battle. There is no battle to be had. It is slaughter. He cuts his own ship's mooring rope with his sword, shouts for his men to row, and they pull away from the deadly circle as fast as they can, watching, helpless, as every other ship in the fleet is destroyed. This is the material breaking point of the Odyssey. Up to now, losses have been terrible but partial. Some men taken by the Cicones. 6 from each ship devoured by Polyphemus. The bag of winds sends them back, but the ships are still there, the numbers still reassuringly large. They are a small navy, a mobile community. In the Laestrygonian harbour that illusion dies. 12 ships go in. 1 comes out. In a few frantic minutes, Odysseus ceases to be a commander of many and becomes the captain of a single lonely vessel. The social world of the poem contracts. There will be no more councils of sailors debating what to do. No more sense that Odysseus has a buffer of other lives between him and disaster. The emotional cost of this is easy to overlook, because the story moves quickly to the next island. But if you pause here, the weight is immense. Almost every comrade from Troy is gone. Men who have marched together under the walls of that city, who have shared spoils and stories and sleepless watch shifts for a decade, vanish into that harbour without graves, without last words. For the survivors on Odysseus' ship, the psychology must be a tangled knot. Grief for friends, horror at the manner of their deaths, a new, sharper fear that the world itself has turned predatory. And underneath all of it, an unspoken question. Why did our ship live when the others died? Odysseus himself carries another heavier question. Could this have been avoided? Did his instinct to stay outside the harbour save the few at the cost of the many? Is that prudence, or is it another form of survivor's guilt, the leader living while those who trusted him die in a trap he chose? The poem doesn't spell out these thoughts, but they hang over everything that comes next. The crew that remains is smaller, traumatized, and even more dependent on a captain whose judgment has brought them through and into so much. From a narrative point of view, this is where Homer quietly clears the board. The Odyssey begins with armies and fleets, with kings among kings. The Laestrygonians reduce all of that to one ship, one set of oars, one fragile band of men bound to their captain by necessity, not numbers. The rest of the journey will not be about managing a miniature society at sea. It will be about the intimate, almost claustrophobic struggle of a few souls, and then, eventually, of one man alone trying to find his way back into a household. After this harbour, every new shore feels more dangerous, because there are no extra lives left to spend. Each choice, each mistake, will land not on anonymous ranks of sailors, but on individuals we have come to know. The story has narrowed its focus from the scale of war to the scale of a single homecoming, and it took the brutal efficiency of the Laestrygonians to make that shift unavoidable. They drift on from the Laestrygonian shore in a state that is beyond tired. It's the numbness that comes after too much horror in too little time, when the mind can't keep up and defaults to automatic motions. Haul the sail, hold the course. Breathe. The sea gives them nothing in return. No comforting wind, no dramatic storm, just an empty expanse that lets the memory of the harbour grind on them in silence. Every man left alive now has faces in his mind that are never coming back. They have seen how quickly a safe place can become a killing ground. They have learned in a single afternoon that there may be no such thing as a truly friendly shore. So when an island rises on the horizon covered in thick woods, ringed with mist, the reaction is not excitement. It is dread mixed with necessity. They have to land. They are hungry, shaken, running low on supplies. They can't live on suspicion alone, but that same suspicion is now wired into every step they take. This island is Aeia, home of Circe. In later ages, she becomes a shorthand for enchantment itself. At this point in the story, she is simply another unknown power on another unknown shore. Odysseus brings them in cautiously, beaching the lone surviving ship and leading them to a sheltered spot. There is firewood, fresh water, some game in the woods, enough to keep basic panic at bay. But as they sit and eat, the trauma finally cracks through the surface. One man, Elpenor, breaks down outright. Others turn on Odysseus again, quietly or openly blaming him for every choice that led them here. It doesn't explode into mutiny, but the trust between leader and followers is fragile. They decide, as always, that someone must scout the island. Information is survival. Ignorance kills. They see smoke rising from deeper in the forest. A sign of habitation. Maybe a farm, maybe a village, maybe a monster's kitchen. Half the crew goes inland under a capable officer, Eurylochus. Odysseus stays behind with the other half, waiting by the ship, holding his own nerves in check. The scouting party moves through the woods and comes upon a clearing. In the centre stands a house that should not exist in the wild, well built, with polished stone and singing voices drifting from inside. Around it roam wolves and lions, but these beasts do not attack. They fawn and wag like dogs, rubbing their flanks against the newcomers. It's terrifying and oddly hopeful at the same time. The boundary between wild and tame, danger and welcome, is already blurred before they even reach the door. Circe appears, in Homer's Greek. She is not a vague sorceress, but a very specific kind of figure, a goddess of drugs, of potions, of knowledge about how materials change bodies and minds. She invites the men in. She offers them a seat, food, wine sweetened and spiced. Only Eurylochus hangs back at the threshold, a man who has learned from Cyclopes and giants that free meals can be very expensive. He watches as his comrades drink. Circe stirs something into the wine, a pharmakon. The word in Greek doesn't just mean poison or medicine, it means a substance of transformation, a thing that can both heal and harm depending on dose and context. The men swallow their memory and will dissolving. With a touch of her wand, Circe erases the last barrier. She turns them into pigs. Homer is precise here. Their bodies become swine. Their minds, he says, remain human trapped inside. They still recognize each other. They still know what has happened to them. They have literally been reduced to livestock, able to understand their humiliation, but unable to speak. On one level, this is just magic. On another, it is metaphor sharpened to a point. Men who have spent years raiding, pillaging, eating other people's stores without consent are suddenly placed on the other end of the relationship. They become the meat. Their human dignity is not destroyed, but it is made irrelevant. They are what can be penned, fed scraps, slaughtered. Eurylochus runs back to the beach, shaking with terror, and tells Odysseus everything. The leader has a choice: protect the few he has left and avoid this dangerous house, or walk directly into the lair of a power that can unmake men with a gesture. He chooses to go on the path through the forest. At the moment when his courage is real, but perhaps not enough, another power intervenes. Hermes appears, not as a bolt from the sky, but as a companion on the road, a god who specializes in crossings, in thresholds, in the movement between danger and safety. Hermes does not fight Circe for him, he does something subtler. He gives Odysseus knowledge. Specifically, he shows him a plant called moly, again described like a real-world herb with difficult-to-pull roots and a dark exterior. White flower. In later centuries, people will try to identify it as garlic, snowdrop, or some lost species. In the story, what matters is its function. It is a counterpharmacon, an antidote to the Enchantress's drug. Hermes also tells him exactly how to manage the encounter. Drink the potion without fear. Let her try to transform you. Then when her magic fails, draw your sword and force her to swear an oath not to harm you. Knowledge in this episode is power raised to its highest exponent. The gods do not stop the spell from being cast. They simply give one mortal the instructions to step outside its effect. Odysseus arrives at Circe's door, is welcomed, is offered the same cup. He drinks. She taps him with a wand. Nothing happens. For the first time, someone stands in her house who does not become what she wants him to be. He draws his sword. The power balance flips so fast it almost causes whiplash. Circe, confronted with a man her usual techniques cannot control, does something interesting. She does not attack. She does not vanish. She collapses into negotiation. She swears the oath Hermes demanded. She promises no more harm if he will sheath his sword and share her bed. The language is frank. Sex and safety are bundled together here as part of a single bargain. In the logic of myth, sleeping together becomes another kind of oath, a way of binding fates. This is where the story moves into a zone of deep ambiguity. Odysseus agrees. He lies with her. His men, when freed from their sty, urge him to leave immediately. Eurylochus in particular is furious that their captain could take comfort with a woman who turned them into animals. But Circe honours her promises. She restores the crew to human form, feeds them, clothes them, and opens her house as a place of rest. The island is suddenly no longer just a site of threat. It becomes a sanctuary, and they stay, not for a night or a week, but for a full year. This year can be read in two opposing ways, and the poem holds both at once. On one hand, it is necessary recovery. The men have seen Troy, the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians. They are traumatized, starving, half mad with fear. Circe gives them time to sleep, to eat full meals, to live without waiting for the next boulder to fall from the cliffs. They regain weight, they regain laughter. The narrative slows down because for once no one is dying. On the other hand, this year is a dangerous seduction. The desire here is not only sexual, though that is present in Odysseus' relationship with Circe. It is the deeper desire to stop moving, to let the journey end in a pleasant elsewhere. Nekyia is a place where responsibilities blur, where the past is kept at bay, and the future is politely ignored. Home becomes a story they tell, not a destination they pursue. Odysseus forgets the pressure of time until the men themselves remind him. It is they who finally say, "We miss Ithaca, we miss our wives and children. The leader who had to drag them away from the lotus fruit must now be dragged away from the arms of an enchantress." Circe does not rage when he announces his intention to leave. She does something stranger and more generous. She shifts from captor and lover into guide. If he truly wants to go home, she tells him, the route is not onward in a straight line across the map. It goes downward, off the edge of the living world. Before he can see Ithaca again, he must sail to the ends of ocean, to the land of the Cimmerians, where the sun barely touches, and there call up the dead prophet Tiresias. This is another moment of transformation, but now it is internal. The journey changes from a sequence of misadventures into a quest that requires confronting the past itself. To go forward, Odysseus must go back, down into the shadows where the cost of Troy, the weight of his choices, and the terms of his future will be spoken aloud. Circe equips him for this crossing. She tells him how to dig the trench, how to pour the libations, how to handle the restless shades. The same goddess who turned his men into swine now gives him the ritual technology to converse with the dead. The road, which has been looping from island to island, now acquires a clear direction, not west or east, but under. From Aei, the Odyssey turns toward the Underworld, and with it, toward the most serious reckoning of the poem. They sail not toward a place on any familiar chart, but toward a boundary. Homer describes it as the edge of ocean, the world river that encircles the land of the living. Beyond it lies a region of perpetual dimness, the country of the Cimmerians, where the sun barely skims the horizon. This is not the underworld as later Greeks will imagine it, with architectural detail and mapped-out districts. It is more primitive and more abstract, a fogged-out edge where the living can just barely make contact with the dead. The logic behind the journey is important. Odysseus doesn't go because he's curious. He goes because he needs information. The gods themselves, through Circe, have said that the path home is blocked by ignorance. Only the dead prophet Tiresias can tell him what lies ahead and how to survive it. Knowledge, once again, is the scarce resource. And now it's not just knowledge of winds and currents, but of fate. They reach the appointed shore. There is no gate, no grand entrance to Hades, just a strip of land between Black Sea and blacker mist. Odysseus follows Circe's instructions exactly. He digs a trench. He pours libations, milk and honey, sweet wine, water. He sprinkles barley. Then he slaughters the sacrificial animals, letting their blood pool in the earth. In Greek thought, blood is life. Here, it's also currency. The dead are drawn to it. Shades swarm toward the trench, insubstantial until they drink. Only then can they speak with strength. Remember who they were. Answer questions. Odysseus stands guard with his sword, holding them off until Tiresias appears. When the blind seer finally comes, it is not with gentle reassurance. His prophecy is conditional from the first words, Odysseus will get home. That door is not locked, but every step between here and Ithaca is ringed with if. If you leave Helios cattle untouched, if your men restrain themselves, if you can master your own anger when you arrive and find your house overrun, if you accept that even a successful return will not be the end of wandering. Tiresias goes further, sketching a future where Odysseus, old and far from the sea, must carry an oar inland until people no longer recognize it. Only then will he make one last sacrifice to Poseidon and die, at last, in peace. Homecoming in this vision is not a clean finish line. It is a negotiated outcome between desire, discipline, and divine resentment. The warning about Helios cattle stands out like a flare. On the island of Thrinacia, Tiresias says, the sun god pastures herds that are sacred, inviolate. If a single animal is harmed, disaster will follow. Odysseus hears it clearly. His survival now depends not only on his own judgment, but on the self-control of a crew already frayed by hunger and fear. Leadership becomes a problem of containment, of other people's appetites as much as monsters. Tiresias steps back, his role complete. But the ritual has opened a door that does not close quickly. Other shades press forward, and what began as a consultation turns into a series of reckonings. The first that truly breaks him is his mother, Anticlea. Odysseus did not know she was dead. She tells him she died not of illness or violence, but of grief, wearing herself out, waiting for a son who never came. Ithaca, in that moment, ceases to be an abstract goal. It becomes a place where his absence has already killed someone he loved. He meets fallen comrades from Troy, each carrying their own version of the war's cost. The dead are not glorified here. They are thin, restless, desperate for a mouthful of blood and a listener. Among them stand two kings whose stories the Greeks knew well, Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon's tale is a warning about home itself. He made it back from Troy, he says, only to be murdered in his own bath by his wife and her lover. For him the danger was not storms or giants, but the people waiting inside the walls. His advice to Odysseus is chillingly practical. Trust no one completely, not even your wife. Plan your return as if entering hostile territory. Achilles, by contrast, undermines the whole heroic value system. He was the greatest warrior at Troy, the man who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Yet in Hades, he tells Odysseus, he would rather be a living nobody, a hired hand on a poor man's farm, than ruler of all the dead. Glory, seen from the other side, is a bad bargain. The songs are for the living. The dead get silence and shadows. These conversations pull the camera back from Odysseus's personal adventure and force him to see the campaign at Troy as a vast machine of suffering that stretched from palace to battlefield to underworld. The victories, the clever tricks, the proud speeches, down here they resolve into a simple question. Was any of it worth the cost? When Odysseus finally tears himself away and drives his men back to the ship, he is not the same man who left Aeaea. He has a roadmap of hazards, yes. He has tactical intelligence about cattle and tempests and suitors. But he also carries something heavier. He has looked directly at the wreckage his world's ideals have made of individual lives. He has heard heroes regret heroism, seen a mother undone by his absence, learned that even a successful homecoming can collapse into betrayal. From this point on, his choices carry a different weight. The curiosity that once pulled him toward every island is tempered by the knowledge of how many ghosts are already walking in his wake. The Odyssey subtly tilts. The story of an adventurer crossing strange seas becomes the story of a haunted survivor trying, against history and habit, to bring a remnant of his world safely home. When they leave the land of the dead and return to Circe, the story changes texture again. The future is no longer a blank map. It is a list of specific hazards with instructions attached. Circe does something unusual for a divine figure in epic. She sits Odysseus down and gives him practical, almost technical advice. There will be sirens, she says, whose song no sailor can resist. There will be a narrow strait, guarded on one side by Scylla, a monster who snatches men from the decks of passing ships, and on the other by Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallows the sea itself. There is no path that avoids danger. There is only choosing how much you're willing to lose, and in what form. Preparation becomes its own kind of magic. Odysseus doesn't pray for the sirens to vanish. He prepares for them with materials anyone could understand, beeswax and rope. The plan is oddly modern. He breaks down the problem and builds a workaround. He wants the knowledge the sirens offer, the promise of hearing everything, understanding everything, without paying the usual price of shipwreck and death. So he has his men stop their ears with wax and orders them, under threat of punishment, to tie him to the mast and ignore anything he says until they are well past danger. When the sirens' voices rise over the water, only he can hear them. Homer's description is brief, but later readers have filled in the gap. Their song is not just erotic or soothing, it is informational. They claim to know all that happens on the earth, to compress the whole world into a pattern of sound. It is the temptation of perfect understanding, of having the chaos of experience arranged into a single, coherent story. Odysseus thrashes, begs, commands his men to release him. He offers them rewards, then threatens them. They respond not to his words, but to the earlier order. Leadership here is not the charismatic speech in the crisis, but the cold decision made in advance and locked in with knots and wax. He has outsmarted himself on purpose. Self-management as a survival skill. Once past the Sirens, the choices grow uglier. Circe has already laid out the logic of the strait. If you steer toward Charybdis, you risk losing the entire ship. If you hug Scylla's rock, you will definitely lose some men, but the vessel will survive. There is no third way. Odysseus does not tell his crew this calculation. He arms himself, though he has been told that no weapon can harm Scylla, and he keeps the plan in his own head. This is another kind of leadership, bearing knowledge that cannot be shared without causing panic or mutiny. They row into the channel, the sea narrows, the water piles up in unnatural ways, and then it happens quickly. Scylla's heads lash out, and 6 men, 1 for each mouth, are lifted screaming into the air. Homer has Odysseus remember the scene with a particular kind of horror. These are not faceless casualties. They are comrades who call his name as they die, reaching toward him with hands already pulled out of reach. He had chosen this, not in the moment, but earlier, on Circe's island, when he accepted the logic that sacrificing a few was better than risking all. The moral injury lies in that gap between planning and impact. He is living in the world Tiresias sketched, a world where survival means agreeing to losses ahead of time and then walking forward anyway. After Scylla and Charybdis, the Odyssey's tone is noticeably darker. The journey is no longer an adventurous tour of wonders. It becomes a sequence of costs paid so that one battered hull can continue moving toward Ithaca. Odysseus is still clever, still resourceful, but the poem begins to suggest that cleverness alone is not enough, and may even be complicit. His intelligence now functions as a tool for managing suffering, deciding who will bear it, on what scale, for what hoped-for outcome. Conquest, if it ever was the point, has fallen away. What remains is the narrower, heavier task, to shepherd what is left of his people through a world where every safe passage has been bought with someone's scream. When they reach Thrinacia, it does not look like a cursed place. It looks like safety, solid land, grass, fresh water. After storms and monsters and the narrow terror of the strait, the crew does what any exhausted group would want to do. They ask for one stop, just to rest. Just for a short time. Odysseus knows this island. Tiresias warned him in the underworld. Circe repeated the warning, "Do not touch the cattle of Helios, the sun god. If you leave them alone, you might all get home. If you harm them, destruction follows." So the danger is not hidden this time. It is written in advance, underlined twice. Odysseus tells the men, he swears them to an oath. No matter how hungry you get, no matter how tempting the herds look, you leave them. You eat what the ship has, you fish. You endure. The problem is that endurance has a clock. They beach the ship. They sacrifice to the gods. The weather looks fair enough. Then the wind changes. Homer describes a long, grinding delay. The storm doesn't smash them immediately. It pins them. Day after day, the wind howls in one direction, making departure impossible. Their food stores run down, the casual luxuries disappear first, then the staples, then even the emergency rations. At some point they go from a little hungry to the bone-deep, thought-consuming hunger that rewires judgment. Discipline frays slowly in layers. Rules that seemed straightforward when the belly was full begin to feel abstract, negotiable. The cattle are right there, healthy, fat, always in view, wandering peacefully along the meadows of the sun god's island. They are living symbols of wealth and plenty, in a world narrowed to storm and salt and empty hands. The taboo on Helios's cattle works at multiple levels. In divine logic, they are the private property of a powerful, watching god. Helios sees everything that happens under the sun. To harm his herd is to insult a being whose gaze you cannot escape. In social logic, the rule is just as sharp. In the world of herders and warriors, cattle are wealth, status, and survival. Raiding someone's herd can be normal warfare. Stealing sacred cattle under oath, after explicit warning, is something else. It is not opportunism, it is betrayal of a promise, of a leader, of a shared attempt to survive together under divine protection. Odysseus holds the line for as long as he can. But leadership, as the Odyssey keeps insisting, has limits. He cannot stop the wind, he cannot conjure food, he cannot stay awake every hour of every day. At the crucial moment he is absent, not in spirit, but literally asleep. After days of hardship and the strain of being the one who keeps saying no, he walks inland to pray, to ask the gods for help. Exhaustion pulls him down. While he sleeps, his authority sleeps with him. His second in command, Eurylochus, voices what many are already thinking. He frames the act not as defiance, but as a kind of desperate, practical rebellion. Isn't it better, he argues, to risk the gods' anger later than to starve now? Can death by shipwreck possibly be worse than slow wasting on this island? He promises they'll offer the best of the cattle in sacrifice, build a temple to Helios when they reach home. He turns sacrilege into a negotiation in advance. Hungry men are easy to persuade. They slaughter the cattle, they roast the meat. Homer adds a grim touch. The hides crawl, the meat bellows on the spits, as if the animals themselves protest. The boundary between living herd and dead feast will not stay clean. When Odysseus wakes and smells the fat, it is already too late. The rule wasn't do not eat, it was do not touch. One act, irrevocable. He rebukes them, but the moral sequence has already unfolded. Tiresias' conditional prophecy has flipped from if you refrain to since you did not. Helios reacts exactly as his divine logic requires. He goes to Olympus and demands justice. If Zeus won't punish the offenders, Helios threatens to take his light away from the world. The sun god is not just a character, he is a cosmic function. His withdrawal would unravel the whole order. Zeus answers with the weapon only he fully controls, the storm that kills not slowly, but all at once. The wind finally shifts enough for them to leave Thrinacia. They think they've gotten away with it. The island shrinks behind them. Then the sky blackens. The description is almost mechanical. A thunderhead gathers. Zeus hurls a bolt straight into the ship. The mast snaps, the hull splits. Men are tossed into the sea, not individually chosen this time, but as a mass. There is no tactical decision, no lesser evil to pick. It is pure consequence, falling from above. Only Odysseus survives. He clings to broken timbers lashed together, rides the surge back toward the place he had already risked to pass, Charybdis. The whirlpool gulps down his makeshift raft. He survives by grabbing the branches of a fig tree and hanging on until the sea spits the wreckage back up. His escape is narrow, almost accidental, but it matches the pattern of his life, a single man held above the general ruin. Being spared is not framed as reward, it is survival with a burden attached. His men are gone, not as faceless extras, but as people he led into oaths he could not enforce, and dangers he could not fully control. The earlier decisions, choosing Scylla over Charybdis, swearing the taboo on Helios' cattle, arrive here as guilt that has no one left to share it. From this point in the story, Odysseus is literally alone. The ship is gone, the crew is gone, the responsibility is not. He is the only living witness to the entire chain. Warning, promise, hunger, breach, punishment. When he finally washes up on Calypso's shore, he carries not just the memory of adventure, but the knowledge that every compromise, every failed order, every divine rule broken or kept has narrowed the world down to one man floating between gods and home. The Phaeacians leave him sleeping. After years of storms and wreckage, and clinging to fig trees above whirlpools, Odysseus finally reaches his homeland unconscious. The Phaeacian ship glides across a calm sea, guided more by custom than by effort. They are the last in a long chain of helpers, the final hospitable island before home. They carry him ashore, lay him down on the sand, and stack his gifts beside him, bronze, cloth, treasure enough to rebuild a life. Then they leave quietly, the way a good host withdraws after doing what honour demands. When Odysseus wakes, the irony is cruel. He is on Ithaca and does not know it. Athena has wrapped the place in mist. The shoreline looks unfamiliar. The hills are strange, he thinks for a moment that he has been cheated again, that another foreign king has sent him off course. This disorientation is not a mistake, it is a pause. The gods are giving him a beat between you survived and you are home. That gap is important, because the second is more dangerous than the first. Poseidon, meanwhile, has watched the Phaeacian ship carry his enemy safely across the sea. The poem shows a god nursing a grudge long past its ordinary expiration date. When the ship turns to head back, Poseidon asks Zeus for a kind of symbolic justice. He cannot undo what has happened to Odysseus, but he can make an example of the helpers. As the vessel nears the Phaeacian harbour, it hardens. Hull, oars, crew frozen in place. The ship becomes stone, a grey shape fixed in the bay. The message is clear. Hospitality toward this man carries a cost. The Phaeacians, frightened, promise to be more cautious, to pull back their generosity. The world of easy passage and magical conveyance begins to shrink. Back on the shore, Athena appears to Odysseus in disguise, as she often does. She does not greet him with a trumpet blast of revelation. She comes as a stranger, tests him, lets him spin an elaborate false story about who he is and where he's come from. Only when he has proven, yet again, his instinct for deception, does she smile and reveal Ithaca under the lifting mist. Then she changes him. In one line, he is the seasoned warrior, scarred and strong. In the next, he is a bent old beggar with ragged clothes, grey hair, skin shriveled by age that he has not yet reached. The transformation is cosmetic but strategic. Athena understands that arriving home openly would be like sailing into another kind of storm. Identity here becomes armour. As a beggar, he is beneath notice. He can move through his own land invisible to those who think they own it. He can watch, listen, test. She sends him first not to the palace, but to a hut, the swineherd's place. Eumaeus lives on the margins of the royal estate, tending pigs in a rough shelter, sleeping among them. In the hierarchy of the household, he is low. In the moral hierarchy of the poem, he is high. When Odysseus arrives at his door, still disguised, Eumaeus does what very few do instinctively. He treats a stranger well for no advantage. He offers food he can barely spare, a seat by the fire, his own cloak, when the night is cold. He complains about the suitors, about the way the household has been eaten from within, but he has stayed. He has not sold out to the stronger party. He has not used the crisis as an excuse to abandon his post. If you want to know what a good household looks like in miniature, Homer seems to say, watch Eumaeus. Loyalty, even when it is not rewarded care. even when no one important is watching. While Odysseus listens, he also speaks, but not with his real voice. He invents a backstory, a whole alternate biography of wars and capture and wandering. These lies are not random, they are instruments. He uses fiction to probe reality. How does Eumaeus talk about his missing master? With what tone? Resentment, indifference, nostalgia? Does he care whether Odysseus lives, or has he already shifted his hopes to the suitors? Every answer is data. Odysseus is taking the moral temperature of his own island, without revealing that the patient is in the room. For a moment, step outside the story. The Odyssey that weaves all these tests and disguises together is a text you can hold. If you ever want to read the whole journey on the page, slowly the way one might walk a coastline, this edition of the Odyssey is available on sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount for listeners of this series. Then we come back to the hut in the hills, to an old friend who does not yet know whom he shelters. Telemachus, meanwhile, has been on his own ark, leaving Ithaca, visiting old comrades of his father, learning what kind of man Odysseus was away from home. Athena now redirects him. The suitors are planning an ambush. She warns him to avoid the obvious routes, to land secretly, to go first to the swineherd's hut, instead of walking straight into the palace. The reunion that follows is one of the quiet, emotional peaks of the poem. At first, Odysseus stays in character, still hunched, still hidden in the old man's skin. He listens to his son's voice, hears the fatigue, the frustration, the sense of being outnumbered. Then Athena lifts the disguise inside the hut, just for the two of them. Odysseus straightens, the wrinkles vanish. The beggar becomes the father Telemachus has never really known. The moment is not shouted, it is stunned. Telemachus doubts, then recognizes. They weep, but not for long. The Odyssey rarely lets emotion sit by itself. It folds back into planning. Because reunion here cannot mean immediate celebration. The palace is still full of armed men eating their way through the estate. Penelope is still encircled. The justice Odysseus dreams of will require something colder than rage, secrecy, allies, timing. Together father and son sketch a blueprint. Odysseus will return to town, still disguised as a beggar. Telemachus must act as if he does not know him. They will count who in the household can be trusted. Eumaeus, the cowherd Phaeacians, a few loyal servants. Weapons must disappear from the hall and reappear in a place only they can reach. Doors must be closed at the right instant. The suitors must be lulled into thinking that nothing has changed. It is not a heroic charge, it is a controlled burn. He has wandered for 10 years trying to get back to a life. Now he must risk that life in his own dining hall, playing the weakest man in the room until the moment comes, at last, to stop pretending. In the morning, the plan walks into town on sore feet. Odysseus goes first with Eumaeus, still bent under Athena's disguise, staff in hand, like any other old man whose life has drifted down to begging. Telemachus comes separately. They cannot arrive together. They cannot look like a unit. The strength of this operation is that nobody believes there is one. The first impact is not epic. It is domestic. The palace that used to be his feels, to Odysseus, like occupied territory. His dogs, once trained to know his scent, either bark or ignore him. The courtyard that should be full of orderly work is cluttered, lazy, loud. The suitors have turned it into a permanent festival, couches dragged into corners, half-finished games, servants running not for honour, but from shouted commands. Here the poem slows down and starts administering tests. One servant, Melanthius the goatherd, sneers at the stranger on the road, kicks him, threatens him, enjoys the power imbalance. For Homer's audience, this is diagnostic. How someone treats a person who looks useless tells you who they really are. Then, at the threshold of the great hall, another figure appears. Argos, Odysseus's old hunting dog, abandoned on a pile of dung outside the palace because nobody cares enough to move him. He is filthy, full of fleas, barely able to lift his head. But he does. He recognizes the man inside the rags. His tail thumps once. He dies. It is a tiny scene, but it condenses 20 years into one gesture. The household has decayed so completely that only a dying dog still remembers how things were supposed to be. Inside, the humiliation begins in earnest. As a beggar, Odysseus asks for scraps at his own table. The suitors see an easy target. Antinous, especially, reacts with open cruelty. He throws a stool, hits the old man, mocks his hunger. Others laugh or look away. A few, like Amphinomus, hesitate, suggest moderation, feel a vague unease without acting on it. The poem is quietly sorting them into columns. Those who are vicious, those who are weak, those who still have some trace of decency. Odysseus absorbs it. Every insult that lands on the old man's body is really landing on the king inside. His hand tightens on the staff. He wants to strike back, to cast off the disguise and end it now. But timing is everything. To kill them in a rage, at a random moment, would be another kind of disorder. He forces the anger down and lets it cool into memory. These slights will be evidence later, justification, fuel that can burn slowly without blinding him. In the middle of this chaos, Penelope moves like someone from another world. She is not naive. She has lived 20 years in a house being hollowed out. She knows how words can be weapons, how appearances can lie. When she hears about the beggar who stood his ground after Antinous struck him, she wants to see him. Partly out of pity, partly because any news from the outside might bring word of her husband. When Odysseus is brought to her rooms, the balance shifts. The man who has been pretending to be less than he is now stands before a woman who may be more than she appears. Penelope questions him, cautiously, about his origins. He answers with another long, careful fiction. But in describing Odysseus to her, what he wore, how he looked, how long ago they met, he slips in details that only a true companion would know. A brooch, a cloak, the way the garment was pinned. Does she recognize him? The poem never says outright. Some readers think she does, and chooses to play along because public recognition would be dangerous. Others think she only feels a deep stirring of hope, a sense that this stranger sees her husband more clearly than any traveller before. What matters is her response. She speaks of her loyalty without bragging about it. She describes the weaving and unweaving of Laertes' shroud, the trick that has bought her time. She weeps, but she does not collapse. Even in grief she is strategic. Her poise under pressure is a mirror to his. In another life, without war and gods, these two would still match each other move for move, that night weary of delay and surrounded by men who treat her fidelity as a game. Penelope declares something that will bring all threads together. She will hold a contest using Odysseus's own bow. This is not an ordinary weapon. It is massive, stiff with age and strength. According to some traditions, it was a bride gift from her father to Odysseus, or a trophy from his youth. In any case, it is intimately his. No one else in the household has ever used it. To string it requires not only physical power, but the exact technique of the man who strung it for years. It is a kind of biometric lock made of wood and horn. Penelope announces the terms. Whoever can string Odysseus' bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through a row of 12 axe heads will win her hand. On the surface, this sounds like surrender. Choose a husband, end the siege. But under that surface it is another test. She sets the bar at precisely her absent husband's height. The contest day is almost ceremonial. The suitors line up, confident. They are young, well-fed, eager to prove themselves. But one by one the bow defeats them. They cannot even string it. They warm it at the fire. They strain and sweat, they grimace, they fail. The hall that has echoed with their laughter now hears their frustration. Telemachus makes a show of trying, nearly succeeding, then deliberately stopping before he does. He too knows the script they are writing. At the edge of the gathering, still dressed in rags, the beggar watches. When the suitors have all tried and failed, he asks for a turn. Outrage explodes. Letting a beggar handle the king's bow seems like an insult to the whole contest. But Penelope, interestingly, says yes. Telemachus backs her. Eumaeus and Philoetius, the loyal servants, ferry the weapon over with a secret joy that the poem lets you see between the lines. Odysseus takes the bow in his hands the way someone takes back a lost part of their own body. He inspects it, flexes it slightly, as if making sure time has not warped it beyond use. Then, with an ease that breaks the suspense like a thread, he strings it in one smooth motion. In that instant the room doesn't yet know it, but the balance of power has already shifted. The beggar is no longer just a test for other people's character. The tests are over. The weapon is ready. The man and the bow are aligned again, and the next arrow will not be for sport. The first arrow is a message. He knocks it calmly, as if he's only checking the bow. It whistles across the hall and passes through all 12 axe heads, as if the air itself has been waiting 20 years for this line to be drawn. Then he turns to Antinous. The man is drinking, cup in hand, mid-sip. Odysseus lets the arrow fly. It hits the throat. No speech, no last boast, just sudden silence from the loudest mouth in the room. Only after the body hits the ground does he speak his name. Not as a plea, but as a verdict. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, has come home. The doors are barred. The weapons have been removed. This is not a brawl. It is an ambush, designed in long, sleepless nights. Telemachus by his side. Eumaeus and Philoetius holding the entrances. Athena in the background, nudging arrows straight and courage steady. One by one, the men who have eaten his food, threatened his son, pressed his wife, fall under spear and shaft. To the poem's original audience, this is justice, Xenia restored by blood. To many modern readers it feels like a massacre. There are pleas for mercy, claims of being misled. Odysseus listens, separates the worst offenders from the merely complicit, but his mercy is narrow. The house has been polluted. Purification, in Bronze Age terms, is not gentle. Only when the hall is cleared, when the bodies are dragged aside and the floors are washed, does the poem allow something softer. Penelope comes down and sees a stranger claiming to be her husband. She has lived 2 decades on stories and impostors. She does not melt, she tests. Her choice is simple and devastating. Move the marriage bed out of their room and make it ready for the newcomer. Odysseus bursts not with jealousy, but with outrage at the impossibility of it. That bed was built around a living olive tree, its trunk carved into the frame. The whole room is constructed around that rooted centre. To move the bed would be to hack the tree down. Only the two of them know this. His protest is a blueprint of their shared life. That is the proof Penelope has been waiting for. Her restraint breaks. Recognition is not fireworks. It is the quiet collapse of defences that have been held too long. The circle tightens once more when Odysseus goes to see Laertes, his ageing father, living half-retired in an orchard. Again he tests, and is tested, revealing himself through details, trees planted, gifts given, memories bound to places. Father, son, and grandson stand together, 3 generations re-knitting a household. But outside the farm, Ithaca has opinions. The dead suitors had families. The island is small. Rumour moves fast. There is a moment when it looks like the story will end not in restoration but in civil war, kin against kin, revenge breeding revenge. At that point, the gods step in. Athena, with Zeus's backing, imposes a kind of spiritual ceasefire. The killing stops. Grief is not erased, but it is contained. The poem closes not with universal satisfaction, but with enforced peace, an end to the story, because endless retaliation would unravel everything the hero has just reclaimed. Underneath all the action, the Odyssey leaves you with a question that doesn't entirely sleep. After a war like Troy, after wanderings like these, who is allowed to belong again? Is home simply a place you take back by force, or a set of relationships willing to recognize you, to be remade with you, despite what you've become? If you've stayed with this journey all the way to Ithaca, you might enjoy wandering even further back in time, to the prehistoric bottlenecks and hidden ancestors that shaped us long before Homer. There's a book about those deep time secrets, and you can find more about it at sleepytimehistory.com. If this helped you drift through the Odyssey, it would mean a lot if you gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more slow history. And, as always, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight?